Colleagues, and good morning to a positively rich array of Cabinet Office talent. You're all very welcome indeed to the committee this morning, and we look forward to catching up to find out what the Cabinet Office has been doing. So let me open up the questioning. Ms Little, I wonder, could you give us a sort of general update as we fast approach the first anniversary of the general election? We've had a lot of either number 10 and or Cabinet Office authored announcements of changes of direction of travel, aspiration, new ways of working, cross-silo, better use of data. The Prime Minister putting us on a war footing with regards to sort of industry, and then government using its powers to sort of help drive that forward, and of course the overarching mission-led approach. So your starter for 10 is, where are we on all of that?
Well, there's quite a lot there. So let me step back and try and give a bit of an end of year report. So as you say, it's been a big transition year for the Cabinet Office, and because we're right at the heart of the strategy for the country and for any government, it means that any of the big issues that we're facing come through our work. And I think it's fair to say that we are facing significant global and domestic challenges, and it's our job in the Cabinet Office to reorganise ourselves so that we can deliver and rise to those challenges. I wrote to you recently setting out the 5 core strategic priority outcomes for the department. We've reorganised everything that we do around the missions, international partnerships, how we support the UK, particularly from an intergovernmental relations perspective, national security, and then also how we deliver a more productive, active and agile state. And all of the things that you've talked about are very specific actions that are part of our delivery in each of those priority outcomes. I think it's fair to say that the Cabinet Office itself has had to go through quite a lot of reorganisation. I gave the committee a bit of an interim update in December. Since then, we have announced our ambitions to be significantly smaller, more strategic in the way in which we provide support to the Cabinet and to our ministers, and more specialist in what we do and what we don't do. And that has involved a significant amount of reprioritisation and clarity about our purpose, as well as some difficult messages for our staff about the size and shape of our organisation going forwards. I think the final thing I'd say, and I'm very happy to take any specific questions on this, is it is unusual to face so many challenges across so many different vectors of what we do, and it's my team's job to make sure that we're able to join up the dots, to step back and see the connections. I think, how would we rate ourselves at this point in time? It is complicated, and there are plenty of challenges that we need to work through. So we're not by any means saying that this is straightforward, and it really matters that the department continues to evolve so that we can deliver our very best across each of those areas.
Is there, how do you avoid the understandable risk of, given the multiplicity of pressures in a very changing and dynamic international landscape and domestic landscape, therefore, as a result, and then there are domestic issues outside of the international sphere, of effectively just firefighting. And what is the challenge, given that we are in a, I think everybody's been trying to draw breath since about 2016 and suddenly realising that the pace of things just doesn't slow down. In fact, it seems to get quicker. How, with a smaller team of people to hand to deploy, how do we just risk of a lot of fires being dampened down, but none of them being put out completely, and the strategic objectives never being fully achieved?
So just a couple of things I'd say about the context. So we've really learned that, one, the domestic and international interface is so closely linked. We've always known that, but I think more than ever we're seeing that in every single thing that we do. So it's important that we have people who are able to operate across both spheres and understand the consequences. And traditionally, we've probably had more emphasis on people working in a global context and a domestic context than we do today. And that will continue to be a feature of our work. The other thing we have to do is to make sure that we have two speeds in the way in which we approach every problem. So we have to be able to react when there are significant crises, and that's why we have a crisis management centre, a resilience team, who very much focus on that, as well as strategy teams who are able to step back. A lot of what we are doing is reorganising so that we have the balance of capability between strategy and crisis response, and that has to happen across everything that we do. So it's just important context and lessons learned. To answer your question, this is not, it is a risk, it is always a risk that delivery is hampered whenever an organisation goes through significant change. I'm very confident that by having less people who are more capable, more focused, more strategic, have greater accountability, that it will be easier to coordinate under pressure. And we've seen that time again. The Cabinet Office, as we discussed at my last session, has taken on more and more responsibilities. It's very thinly spread. And whilst it's a large department, it is touching the surface of lots of very difficult issues. And what we're trying to do here is to focus on a smaller number of bigger issues and to have real depth and real leadership capability and more seniority in quite a lot of what we do, so that we can coordinate more easily. The bigger the department has got, the harder it has been to ensure collective movement, collective join-up. It's just impossible to do with an organisation at that scale.
You mentioned in answer to my opening question that part of your strategy, which I applaud, is to effectively not do as much. But you and I know, this committee knows, that in recent years the Cabinet Office has become the receptacle of things which too many departments have deemed to be in the too difficult tray or slightly complicated. Oh, I know, we'll shuffle it off to the Cabinet Office. They're good at these sorts of things. So that involves the Cabinet Office actually pushing back and saying, no, this falls within your bailiwick. You crack on with it. What if they turn around and say, what's the risk, I should say, of them going, right, well, we're not going, if the Cabinet Office isn't going to do it, we're not going to do it. And therefore the job, whatever the job might be, isn't actually done. Because it's quite hard in government to say to another department, no, we're not doing this.
So yes, to agree with the risk and the implied challenges there. And I think it's our job in the Cabinet Office to look at the health of the overall system. So quite often people think that being closer to the Prime Minister or closer to the centre of government, it means you've got more levers to get things done. Our job is to make sure that all departments have the levers and the accountability and the empowerment to deliver. And I think a really good example of that is the recent machinery of government change to DSIT, where there are lots of challenges in moving that sort of cross-cutting function to what we would call a line department. The fact that we even call other departments a line department in Whitehall parlance is quite interesting. But we've really focused on saying, look, what authority, what accountability, what levers do we give those departments so that they can succeed? And I think it needs a whole change of mindset under mission-led government to think about systems and our role being about setting up the system to succeed, not to just take things off people and do it ourselves. That cannot be the answer when you're trying to deliver so many big, difficult things.
Thank you. When you first appeared before this committee, we had quite a good exchange with regards to data and government's use of, and indeed the wider civil service understanding of what data could be shared and how it could be shared, that it was corporate government data not owned by, Mrs. Smith in this directorate or Mr. Smith owned in that, and people being sort of slightly precious about it. And you intimated at that juncture that you were driving forward a sort of data usage and share best practice approach. Where are we on that?
Yeah, so we work in partnership with DSIT, who've now taken on the responsibility for for data on a cross-cutting basis. But it permeates so much of what we do that we do it together. And the National Data Library you've probably seen is a signature programme that DSIS is taking forward. That's an attempt to bring all government and eventually public sector data together in a secure environment that we can use for research, for development, for decision making, in a way that we haven't been able to do before. To do that, you've got to have clean, high quality data, and so we've got very clear data standards. We've been working with a number of departments on pilots to really test the boundaries of some of the challenges around sharing data. More often than not, we find it's a cultural thing rather than a legal or a practical thing. So we need to raise the game on people's understanding of what the data sharing rules are. And as I mentioned to the committee, we've done a lot of training across the whole of the civil service on this. So we're making progress towards the National Data Library, we're embedding standards, and we're really strengthening DSIT and the role of the DDAP function to be the owners in departments of data standards for the whole of government.
3 final quick questions from me. Cabinet Office, number 10, Treasury, the 3 great Leviathans of your state, as it were. Are you anticipating in the upcoming spending review from Treasury a change of approach of analysis and priority setting, cross-silo, cross-department, on mission-led approach, or should we brace ourselves for a traditional type spending review and subsequent events?
So, and obviously this has already taken place in the planning phase. As you know, the government has published a plan for change.
Yes.
The plan for change is the very specific delivery milestones across the missions that the government will prioritise in the coming few years. And that is the basis upon which the spending review will be prioritised. So I obviously can't talk about what the decisions will be made, but I can tell you that the plan for change will be the priority and the basis upon which we look at systems and cross-cutting funding.
Yes. I mean, I'm slightly worried listening to the debate yesterday about teachers' pay, and certainly music coming out from number 10 was that any increase above that which the Treasury budgeted for would have to be met by in-year departmental budget. It suggests to me that there's a real risk of the traditional Treasury attention bidding war of individual departments. Well, we'll have that, but take it off so-and-so. Should we expect sort of collective representations from Secretaries of State to the Treasury to say, this is a mission, there's 2 or 3 departments involved in delivering it, you have to think about funding it in this particular way, or is it going to be Secretary of State A, Secretary of State B, Secretary of State C, each making their bid?
So the process has been set up in a more systems cross-cutting way. So, for example, the technology approach has been cross-cutting and horizontal. As I mentioned, the plan for change has been cross-cutting. It's been very collaborative. We've had mission-based discussions with all departments involved to look at the plan for change and how we're going to pool resources. So look, decisions haven't yet been made. There always has to be a moment where the Treasury provides a negotiated settlement with a department. That is unavoidable. But the inputs have been really systems-led and very cross-cutting. So we shall see what decisions are made in the course of the coming weeks.
I, for one, said a silent prayer of thanks when we heard from the CDL the other month, where he was keen to stress how keen he was to encourage an appetite to innovate, which may lead initially to failure, but fear of failure shouldn't be the inhibitor to the attempt at the innovation. How is that manifesting itself, both within the Cabinet Office and in the wider service?
Well, I think the biggest shift is a cultural one, and it's probably the hardest and the most important part of a test and learn approach. And so, being able for the CDL and I to talk openly to staff about it is okay if things do not turn out perfectly at every first attempt. Like we want you to test, be experimental, to be innovative, to take risk, and we almost want you to not get it right first time because we want to learn from it and make it even better. So being able to have that very explicit conversation is a really big shift in the culture and the change that we're trying to achieve. I wouldn't underestimate that. We are also embedding it in just good practice. So when we look at how we develop policy, and we might come on to mutually agreed exits, that's a really good example of where we're using a test and learn approach to trial how we develop the policy by just doing some mutually agreed exits and developing the policy as we go. Another good example is the way in which we've set up the Infected Blood Compensation Authority. It's a really complex system. So we are using test and learn, but I think the game changer is the cultural shift.
And is that happening across Whitehall?
I think it's still inconsistent. So every single department has got a reform programme which is part of our work on the productive and agile state. And every department is implementing it in different ways, and actually some are more advanced than others. So I'm confident that the whole of Whitehall is heading in the same direction, really wanting to experiment and take risk. But is it consistent in terms of outcome? Yes, I think it's early to tell.
I think it's got warmer, and I could be wrong. What's the temperature of the civil service bathwater, according to the Prime Minister's thermometer? We started tepid about 5 months ago. It sounds like it sort of warmed up a bit, but not to a level of uncomfortability.
So, look, I mean, we very humbly continue to deliver and drive forward change. That is our job. And we also very humbly accept that we don't always get things right. So I think what's important is we apply that test and learn approach to everything we are doing openly with political colleagues, and that is how the civil service operates.
It sounds like the water's getting warmer.
I will let my stakeholders and the government decide that. But
it's not a bad thing, because I think warmer water will act as a spur to change.
I think there's a lot of energy and momentum, yes. And we are doing a lot. So, you mentioned yourself, the Cabinet Office has made a lot of announcements in a short space of time. We are getting on and we are delivering, and that is the most important thing for the country. It's a wonderful
segue, Ms Little, to Ms Edwards' questions, because we're going to turn now to departmental priorities.
Thank you, Chair.
Lauren.
Thank you. I would just like to firstly start, we obviously have a focus on looking forward, but I'm also interested in how things have gone, particularly as we're looking at the Cabinet Office accounts for the year ending March 2024. It's a little bit of a confusing picture, I must say, as somebody coming new to it. So I think we have in July 2023, we have ministers saying the departments won't be required to publish outcome delivery plans for that financial year, really just to focus on the Prime Minister's priorities. And I think we have your predecessor, Kat, telling the previous committee last year that these ODPs were being produced annually still, and they were being used internally, but not actually being published. So just a central question, really. Can you sort of elaborate on what progress the department did make in that financial year in terms of achieving the outcomes it was wanting to seek? And how can we as parliamentarians and the broader public know about that?
Indeed. So, and it's worth talking through the different years and where we are now, if that's useful for the committee. So in the financial year 23-24, the annual report and accounts in its opening performance section sets out the strategic priorities and our progress. And we always were very, very keen that even though we might not have published our ODP at the time, that we were able to share with Parliament precisely our assessment of how we'd used funds and what we'd achieved. So I hope that the annual report and accounts gives a good summary appraisal, and I'm happy to take any questions on the detail there. Transparency really, really matters. This is a transition year, so the year that's just gone by, as you know, has been a transition from one government approach to another. And so what we've said for the year 25-26 is that given this is a transition period, we would expect for every department to share openly their strategic outcomes as part of their annual report and accounts, to set out specifically what they've achieved and what they've delivered. and obviously through the select committee process be held to account for those outcomes, which is why I wrote to you to say this is what I'm seeking to achieve as a department. You should feel able to ask us any questions about that at any point in time. So that is the main form of accountability. Because the spending review on a multi-year basis is currently underway, we're currently working through what is the more sustainable approach to planning and performance across government. And I'm expecting as part of the spending review for future years for us to agree what the whole performance and planning process should be, and I commit to providing the committee with an update in due course.
Thank you. What is the status then of outcome delivery plans? Do they have a future under the current plans that you're looking at?
Under current plans, so we currently are drafting a final version of our outcome delivery plan in the Cabinet Office, and I intend to share that with you as a committee so you can read our plan, subject to ministers agreeing it. So I'm hoping that will be approved and signed off shortly. The Treasury and I wrote to every government department to say, given this is a transition year, we expect everyone to have a plan. And what I have seen is that most government departments have adopted the practice of the outcome delivery plan in practice. It will depend by department. So during this period, every single department should have a plan and should be very open with their select committees about the priority outcomes they're seeking to achieve.
Okay. And in terms of the strategic priorities, particularly those that you wrote to us about recently, presumably then they will be reported against in the next annual plan, annual reports and accounts for the Cabinet Office.
Correct.
Okay.
Which will be for 25-26, and I hope to submit to Parliament by the summer of 2026.
Okay. And could you just elaborate sort of on what you see as the really key strategic priorities for the Cabinet Office?
So as my letter said, there are 5, and they are big strategic priorities. So delivering the missions and being the systems oversight for the missions, our international partnerships, and in particular the relationship with the EU and the US, our UK responsibilities, the Constitution and ethics, our national security priorities, and then the productive and agile state and the running of the civil service. They're the 5 big priority outcomes that we are organising ourselves around. And I should say that the Cabinet Office has also restructured around those 5 priority outcomes. So we're calling each one of those outcomes a pillar, and there is a specific senior pillar lead for each of those areas who is accountable for delivery, which is how we're doing our performance management in the department itself. So for missions, that's Clara Swinson as our second permanent secretary. For international partnerships, that's Michael Ellum. For the UK and intergovernment relationships, that's Darren Tierney. For national security, that's overseen by Jonathan Powell, but official level by Matt Collins. And for the productive and agile state and the civil service, that's me.
Okay, thank you. And within that framework, how are you ensuring that the Cabinet Office is getting that cross-Whitehall viewpoint that it needs to achieve a lot of the government's missions?
Yeah, so there's a number of ways we do that. Everything we do in the Cabinet Office is as a systems leader. There's not a single problem that we deal with or a single ambition or opportunity or risk that doesn't involve us having to work with other government departments. So through our secretariat, it's our job to make sure that we understand the consequences and impact of government policy on everything that we do. And the secretariats, their core purpose is to collect information to ensure that we're cohering collective accountability and decision making. In our policy teams, again, it's their job to operate in a collaborative way, and I think there's a big shift in our mindset under mission-led government to make sure that we are actively bringing in different perspectives, different insights, and it's not just about talking within the bubble of the kind of central government machinery. We need to work with all of our partners, with civic institutions, with academia, and the strategic supply chain as well, for example. And then in the way in which we're set up, whilst we've got these kind of 5 pillars, the mechanics of how the Cabinet Office operates means we have to constantly meet as a team to talk about the interrelationships and the dynamics. So whether that's our kind of Monday strategic, how do we fit all of this together meeting, or whether it's the ExCo which is our executive committee, taking oversight or whether it's our ministerial meetings where we sit together across all of those pillars and talk about how we're joining up with departments. There's lots of mechanisms to make sure that that happens in practice.
Thank you. And will the future annual reports and accounts sort of be opining on the success of those structures that you've put in place to get the cross-Whitehall view?
So when you say opine, it's quite a hard thing to opine on. I think it's our job to set out what the outcomes are. So the outcomes that we're really interested in is, do we live within our budget and within our resource allocations to deliver the 5 strategic outcomes I've talked about? You know, for national security, to what extent have we been able to maintain peace and domestic resilience? It's quite a hard thing to assess, but we will do our very best to set out how we've judged that, what resources we've used, and whether we've achieved those outcomes. I think there's a separate question about whether the restructure of the Cabinet Office has delivered, and the metrics there have got to be performance, budgets, headcount, and whether the outcomes have led to a happier, healthier department. So we will definitely set those things out.
Just a final question. What do you see as the main risk to the Cabinet Office being able to achieve its objectives over the next year?
I think it's the conflation of the issues it's the concurrent challenges that we are dealing with. We're asking a lot of our people who work very long hours, quite often under crisis circumstances, 24/7. We're a very, very varied business. So, my job is to make sure that we look after our people whilst we're changing ourselves, and we are delivering some very big things for the country. And if at any point we think that risk of delivery is likely, then we obviously need to reset and put in place contingency plans or slow down the pace of change that's on the way. But it's concurrent risk.
Anything else?
No, it's fine.
Okay, Mr. Lamont. We're going to look at staffing and consultants, I think.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry, Chair.
Oh, forgive me. Sorry.
It was just one to stay on topic. Sorry, Mr. Lamont. Okay, this can be a question to all, really. Do you think your department would benefit from or want more ministerial direction?
Sorry, do you mean, when you say ministerial direction,
in terms of what you want to achieve, do you feel you've got enough of a direction from government to achieve what you want?
Yes, I really do. We have a very clear set of priorities in the plan for change. I have very clear outcomes that have been articulated, published, and set out, and we also have very clear direction for the civil service. So I feel I've got my marching orders, and I am making sure that we're set up to deliver. But I'm conscious I've done a lot of talking, so I'm very keen to hear if any of my colleagues would want to add to that.
So I would echo that. The missions, the plan for change, the milestones within create an incredibly powerful set of direction for our workforce, and not just within the department but cross government. So I would very much echo that.
Thank you. And then I guess the last one is there anything more you'd want from MPs to help you achieve your goals?
That's not a question I've thought about, and I probably should. Obviously, it is for our political ministers and leaders to consider how they use the experience of Parliament. When it comes to the Select Committee, I hope you know that I really appreciate your constructive challenge. I welcome having open debates about some of the issues that we're facing, because I think they're complicated. We don't have all the answers, and we want to get your perspective, as well as other witnesses that you speak to on a regular basis. So I think, when it comes to the broader parliamentary system, that's probably more a question for my political ministers.
And I think just on that point,
Excuse me.
because you, Miss Little, are very good at making yourself available to parliamentary committees, for which the House is grateful, and I just want that on the record. But do always feel free, with an open invitation, to think whether we can ask about cross-cutting and silos and all the rest of it, but we then remain siloed in our approach to questioning, etc. If there's anything that we can do collaboratively, I think you'd say particularly between this committee and PAC, where we could possibly be covering the same ground, but freeing up some of your time to actually get on and do the day job, as it were, rather than coming back to report to people how you're doing the job. Almost let the results speak for themselves. That's an open invitation. It doesn't require a response now. Mr. Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning. My questions are going to be around Cabinet Office staffing, so I'm not quite sure which one of you is best placed to answer. The annual report noted a modest fall in the headcount in the last financial year. But it was reported last December in the Financial Times, I think, that you were to cut another 400 positions. And then in the BBC this year, April this year, it was reported that it rose into 2,100. My first question is, do you recognise those figures?
Yes, and I might ask my Chief Operating Officer, Sarah Harrison, to add to this. But I should probably explain the difference between the 400 and the recent announcements, because there's a few things that have changed since December when we made the initial announcement to reduce the size of the department. Firstly, that was constrained by what we could afford. As you all know, the voluntary exit process incurs a payment to individuals under a tariff compensation system. And so we knew we needed to get smaller at that point in time, and we knew we needed to restructure, and we felt it was important to be open to staff and to start that process. So we constrained the voluntary exit scheme by the funding available. The things that's changed is, firstly, the Treasury's made available matched funding for voluntary exit schemes. So they recently announced a transformation fund with £150 million of additional match funding to be made available. That really does change the dynamics of what we can do. The SR assumptions have also been published in that period, so 5% efficiency savings and a 15% administrative cost reduction for every single part of government. That is quite a significant shift in the assumptions we had made in December, so all of our work now has got to deliver those assumptions. And also we've had new leadership, so you've obviously met with the new Cabinet Secretary. We've also taken into account his leadership priorities to make sure that the Cabinet Office is set up to succeed for the whole of the civil service. So those are the things that have changed. And that 2,100 number is made up of 540 exits under the voluntary exit scheme. It's up to that number because what you tend to find is people drop out as the process continues. So that relates to the 400 that we announced in December. There's 900 people who'll exit the department because of machinery of government changes, because we're no longer doing some of the things that we were doing. And then the further 600 to 700 gap is what we expect to further reduce by over the course of the spending review period as we now restructure the department. So that's how the numbers correlate and reconcile.
Okay. It'd be useful to know what the difference is between the mutually agreed redundancy compared to compulsory redundancy, and also just how much this whole process has cost.
Yeah. So, and again, Sarah, you might want to add to this, but there are 4 different types of exit from the civil service apart from resignation. So a voluntary redundancy, a voluntary exit, which is what we announced in December, is where we set up a scheme and people can choose to leave the department in exchange for a payment. And that is nothing to do with restructuring or roles. It is basically people putting their hand up and saying, I'd like to leave the department in exchange for a payment. A voluntary redundancy is where we restructure the department, we might remove their role, and people at that point are offered an exit package. And again, that is voluntary and they can choose to do it. Compulsory redundancy is when an individual is restructured, their role is removed, and they refuse a voluntary exit. And we're basically saying, after looking for other job opportunities for you, there is nothing left for you to do, and therefore we are making you leave the organisation. The mutually agreed exit is common in every other organisation I've ever worked in, and it is not prevalent in the civil service, and we think it should be. Because it's where a grown-up conversation can happen between the employer and an individual to say we mutually agree that we would like for an individual to leave the department under the civil service compensation scheme, and it is meant to be a much more mutual way for people to part an organisation. So it still is in exchange for a payment, but it will vary and it will change depending on depending on the circumstances. So they're the 4 different types. And I might pass to Sarah to talk about the costs of the scheme.
Just before we do it, on the payment bit, so you've alighted upon somebody who is, for want of a better phrase, surplus to requirements, and you have your grown-up conversation. Is there a qualitative assessment that comes into that? Because if you're getting rid of them because they're just not very good, or their CV didn't match their delivery, as it were, the taxpayer might get a wee bit angry for tax dollars being used to effectively usher out of the door of failure.
Which is why it does not apply for people who are in poor performance measures. So we should never be using taxpayers' funds to pay for people who are on poor performance. There is a very clear process for anyone who is not living up to the expectations of a role. And of course, we want to support people to either upskill or develop to do the job. Yes. But if that is not possible, then formal poor performance processes should be enacted and delivered swiftly. So a mutually agreed exit is not for poor performance. It's quite often in the civil service where you've employed someone to do a particular job, the job changes, but skills of the individual might not match up to that, or simply the job's change. And you get that a lot in the Cabinet Office because our role changes quite significantly depending on the government of the day. So we would never use taxpayers' funds where poor performance is the issue.
Just a couple of comments perhaps on mutually agreed exits relative to voluntary redundancy. And voluntary redundancy is a mechanism, as indeed the Cabinet Office is deploying through its current voluntary exit scheme, where applications are progressing at the moment, tend to be things that you use where you're doing large-scale restructurings, either in teams or across a department, whereas the mutually agreed exit, by its nature, is much more of an individually focused tool. And I suppose, overall, by adding the mutually agreed exit to our portfolio, we've got more flexibility to be able to ensure that the department is set up for success for the future. Just in terms of the payments, I mean, the straight answer is that actually what individuals will receive, for example, through a voluntary exit, will depend upon a number of variables. It'll depend upon their grade, it will depend upon what's called their reckonable service, in other words, the amount of time they've been in the civil service. So individuals will receive different levels of payments, but these are all prescribed and set out through the civil service compensation arrangements. And of course, in some cases, they have fixed caps on the amount of payment that can be made as well, and that's all preset.
In terms of the overall costs, I'm not asking for the individual package for departing employees, but how much does this cost the Cabinet Office, this process of reducing your headcount?
So at the moment, the provision that we've put aside for the voluntary exits, which is the first phase that Kat has referenced, which is actually over 500 FTE, which is above the 400 we originally provisioned for, because we wanted to respond to staff's response to that. So we've set aside 27 million for those payments, and obviously we're going through now a process of restructuring and reorganisation, deploying the tools. I think in the main, the balance of the 1,200 who will be leaving, the 600 to 700 that Kat referenced, we want to seek to redeploy those staff as much as possible to opportunities that may exist across other government departments. Some of those will leave as a matter of natural turnover, and some of them, of course, will secure some of these voluntary exit routes that we've described. We want to avoid, if we possibly can, redundancy, but we've also been clear that that may not be the case across the board, and therefore that may be necessary. And obviously, therefore, the calculation, the cost associated with that balance of 600 to 700 is something that we'll have to establish as we go through the next business planning round.
What I'm struggling with just a little bit is, whilst on the one hand you're cutting the number of full-time staff, on the other hand you're increasing the number of contractors and temps coming into the Cabinet Office. The costs associated with those have gone up quite significantly.
So that is not the intention. And I know in the accounts you can see that we've got large numbers of off-payroll and contingent labour costs. That is for the 23-24 financial year, and is not the case as we are today. And it's certainly not our intention in the future. Quite a lot of in fact, the vast majority of people who are now exiting the building will not be backfilled. because these are meant to be permanent reductions to the cost base of the department. So that is not the intention in our future plans.
What sorts of roles were these contractors and temps performing in the Cabinet Office?
So, and Sarah should add to this. So we have several different categories. We've got contingent labour, contractors, we've got off-payroll commitments, and we've also got consultants. So it's important to make a distinction across all those different things.
But if I focus on the 854 off-payroll, which is featured in the annual report, it's worth just reflecting. Of course, the Cabinet Office by its nature provides a lot of services across government. So quite a large number of that cohort, in fact, will be doing probably one of two things. They will be working with the Infrastructure Projects Authority, and they will be providing external assessment for cross-government projects, and they're bringing either independent experience or indeed particular expert experience. And the second cohort will in fact be assessors who will be assessing colleagues in the commercial function as they go through the necessary testing to achieve and attain the right levels of capability that we want from our commercial professionals across government. In most of those cases, those people will actually only be working 1 or 2 days, as it were, but it makes more sense to bring them on board as off payroll, and in that way to both gain the value of their independence and indeed their expertise. So that's the largest cohort. It's roughly about 470 of that number. Then the balance will be really working across the department, but a large cohort of those will be working in digital and technology areas where sometimes it's necessary to secure particular expertise in some of the disciplines of the digital and data profession. And of course, we're reflecting now on the 23-24 annual report, and when you see subsequent annual reports, you will see that number change because a number of those digital and technology professionals will be moving, or their roles will be moving as part of the machinery of government change. Just
to be clear, are you saying this figure, this budget line will be zero moving forward, or it will be falling, or it will be less, or will it be more? I'm just not clear. I mean, it sounds to me from what you just said, Sarah, they're performing a relatively important role within government, but on the other hand, you're trying to reassure me that this is not something that's been done to replace the people who have been made redundant.
On the off-payroll, of the numbers that Sarah's just spoken to, because of the machinery of government changes, the vast majority won't be in the department anymore. So you will see a significant reduction. About 400 of those off-payroll people are in the IPA, now NISTA in the Treasury. And the balance is a much smaller number. The other thing that's going on is we've got a target to reduce consultancy costs by half. So you will see a steady decline at a peak during COVID, where we were using quite a lot of consultancy. You can see from the accounts. You will see a significant reduction in the cost of consultancy and contingent labour.
Okay, the last point on this from me is just around working from home. Proportion of the Cabinet Office staff are working from home?
So every member of staff has the same policy for the whole of the civil service, which is that we ask people to be in the office or in their workplace, wherever that might be, for at least 60% of their contracted time. In the Cabinet Office, we have a significantly higher level of attendance, and that's partly because of the nature of our job, where so much of what we do is crisis management, it is 24/7 national security work, and it is very senior ministerially facing. So as you can see from the reported data for our office utilisation, we're quite often up into the 60, 70, 80%, depending on what's going on.
Okay. And are you confident that more junior members of the civil service have the ability to work from home in terms of the accommodation they have available to them at home to allow them to do that if that is what is required? And secondly, in terms of career development, I've certainly had constituents come to see me who are concerned about more junior members of the team not developing the way that we might have done in the old days, because they don't have that same interaction with more senior members.
We share that concern, which is why we set the policy at 60. There's no right or wrong. You can debate the precise number, but the outcome we're trying to achieve is an environment where people are learning on the job from more senior, skilled and experienced line managers. And to do that, you do generally need to be together if you apply a 70-20-10 approach to learning and development, 70% of your learning has to come from being on the job, seeing how senior people do things and learning in multidisciplinary project teams. So that's why it's so important that we ensure that our staff are coming together to learn. And I'm very confident that we do provide our staff with the opportunities. We encourage people who've got any concerns to talk to their line managers. We support people through providing facilities, technology, occupational health support. It matters that people have got the space and the right technology and the right kit to work effectively.
Thank you, Chairman.
Just one quick question. I think possibly this might be to Ms. Harrison. The revolving door. Somebody negotiates their exit payment, then within a time frame they pop back up as a much needed consultant or elsewhere in the civil service. Going back to the quick exchange that Ms. Little and I had about taxpayers' dollar, how can you assure this committee that this is not or could be abused as a sort of get rich quick scheme, paying off, and then somebody resurrects themselves Phoenix-like in pretty short order, also as a public servant?
I suppose first I would say our overall goal is to ensure that we bear down on the use of consultants and contingent labour. That applies no matter what, and we can talk a bit more about that, we've already achieved that in respect of consultancy, yes. And our goal will continue. So that's the first place to start, to reassure the taxpayer on how we are using public money. The second, I'd say, is that in respect of voluntary exits from the department, or indeed any department, under the voluntary exit scheme, there are fixed rules that apply in relation to people's ability to be able to return to the civil service. Under mutually agreed exits...
Could you share what those are?
I can certainly ensure that we follow up with the committee just to restate that. Under mutually agreed exits, which is a new approach, we're in the pilot stage of that as a department, working very much with the cross-government people function on that. And obviously these are exactly the sorts of issues that we will want to get into to ensure that these are credible routes and support the overall objective in terms of getting the department into the right size for the future, but not, of course, putting at risk value for money and indeed taxpayer spend.
I mean, if you can write to us setting out that criteria and means of clawback, if necessary, if somebody leaves on a Thursday and next Tuesday they're in a different department, etc. Super. I think we're now going to turn to infected blood. I'm turning to Mr. Quigley and then to Ms. Edwards. Richard.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So £11.8 billion has been put aside over the time of this government. How's that figure been come to, and are you confident that's actually a final figure?
Yeah. I can tell you that, this is a central estimate, and I can tell you it is highly unlikely to be the precise final figure because it is an estimate that is quite a complicated model. And I would make a distinction between the level of uncertainty that we've got between infected and affected cohorts. So for the infected assumptions that we're making in the payments, it's, as you know, entirely in line with the statutory compensation scheme, and the way in which we've modelled all of this is obviously compliant with that. We know more about the people who are infected, and that makes it easier for us to make some assumptions about what the likely cost would be. But even then, we're finding complexities in the modelling. For the affected, we really have a very, very broad range of uncertainty because we are still going through the process of identifying who is affected, and it really does depend on the nature of how you've been affected and the consequences as to what sort of compensation you'll be likely to get. So this model has been developed in partnership with and very openly with the Treasury to make sure that we've got a very good understanding of what that range is. But there is a chance it could be either significantly higher or lower. We just don't know. We have to update that model on a very regular basis and transparently share that information with the Treasury so that they can best adapt and provision for funding, depending on where that information takes us. But it takes time. We need to make more payments. We need to learn more about the uncertainties that we've got so that forecast and that estimate can improve.
Thank you. And so Brian Langstaff is doing his report on the speed of payments. Sort of the perception is the frustration of the slow pace. Do you share that frustration, and what do you think can be done to speed up the payment process?
Well, we all very personally share that ambition to make payments swiftly, and our ministers and the Infected Blood Compensation Authority Board and we as the sponsoring department are very, very committed to that. And we are doing everything we can to make sure that the victims of this tragedy get their payments as quickly as we can. It's worth just remembering what the kind of big commitments are. So we've already said we want to make sure that we make the first payment to an infected victim by the end of last year. We've done that. We want to make sure that we make the first payment to an affected victim by the end of this year, having only just in March finalised the statutory levels of the compensation scheme, and we're still going through the process of identifying people. And we want to get the majority of and the bulk of people who have been infected paid by the end of 2027. We are very much doubling down and making sure we're doing everything that we can. So I'm confident that the Infected Blood Compensation Authority is doing absolutely its utmost to do this swiftly, effectively, and as carefully and thoughtfully, because I think the big thing that we've really learned in the payments that we've made is support to victims and making sure that we are going through this with families, with those who are impacted. It matters to go through this process in the right way as much as it matters to get payments out swiftly.
Thank you. And I guess you, going back to the earlier point about learning, you have learned a lot. Do you feel like you've now got the capability to oversee a similar scheme? God forbid something should happen on this, but do you think you've got the capability as a department to oversee such a scheme again?
So one of the things that we've done in setting up in a kind of greenfield way our approach to compensation payments is to look at how can you use AI, the very latest data and digital tools, to basically set up a greenfield approach to compensation and to payments generally. And I'm very grateful to colleagues at the DWP they are obviously the payments experts in government, as are the Digital Centre of Excellence in DCIT. They've worked very closely with us to say, could you adapt some of what we're doing in future if we need to? And I think we probably can. I would stress, though, that the complexities and the unique nature of the compensation scheme for infected blood means it is not as simple as picking something up and moving it. And we found that when we were setting up the authority, when we turned to other big payment organisations in government, it wasn't as simple as saying, let's use your payment approach, because there is so much that's bespoke to the scheme in order to do it in the right way.
Thank you, Chair.
Lauren.
Thank you. Just wondering if there are any lessons from this experience that you think are relevant, in particular for the compensation scheme that's been set up for the victims of the Post Office Horizon IT scandal.
Yes, so we do work very closely with other departments who have got similar either compensation schemes, or obviously in our work on inquiries we work very closely with others, and we have shared what we've learned so far with DBT and with teams involved. It's a real balance, and a lot of this is about risk appetite, because obviously the faster you make payments, the more you are likely to get things wrong. And depending on the type of compensation scheme, depending on what you're trying to achieve and the nature of the scheme, I think that sort of risk appetite has got to be taken on a local basis. But the risk appetite we've set for infected blood, we've shared sort of how we've done that and how we've then mirrored that level of risk-taking in our approach, which I hope has been useful.
It's helpful to hear. And have you made any sort of suggestions in terms of processes that other departments in Whitehall could take on?
Yeah, so I think, it's quite interesting to setting up a brand new public body. We, as you know, we're trying not to set up lots of new big public bodies at the moment, but actually doing that very, very quickly under this level of urgency. We've learnt quite a lot, just generally. and in particular how you get the right leadership, the right technology, how you share platforms with departments, how you copy and paste as much as possible, so you're learning from best practice has been our approach. And I think in time, I think it's probably a bit early to tell, but in time, when we have fully established the case management system, the digital tools, the idea is that you would be able to replicate and use those systems more expansively.
Thank you.
Richard Baker.
Thank you, Chair. Just a brief follow-up, Captain, timescales for payments, if that's okay. You mentioned a couple of the target dates for payments for infected people. A number of affected persons by, the siblings and the families of people lost their lives affected blood have also been waiting a long time for payment. And the infected blood inquiry heard that the target for payment of the bulk of affected persons was by the end of 2029. Is that also your intention to keep to that timescale?
That is absolutely correct. And sorry, I should have mentioned that fourth target. There are 4 that we've clearly set out, and everything we do, and particularly as the sponsoring department with our ministers, is to work with IBCA so that we're meeting those targets, and I'm confident that we are on schedule to meet those targets.
Thank you.
Just a sort of hanging thought, as it were. You're the department who sort of holds the baton for public inquiries, which seem now to take longer and longer and longer, almost to the extent that by the time they get to their conclusions, one's almost forgotten what the question was. There's usually quite a long lead-in time to the inquiries being set up. There's a long time for them to be held, and then there's a considerable amount of time whilst government reflects, and then there's a considerable amount of time whilst government creates the rubric, the digital support, the case management stuff, in order to facilitate payments, if indeed payments are to be made. One's often dealing in those sets of circumstances with vulnerable people who feel broadly let down by the state for a whole variety of reasons. Is anybody thinking about, whilst not losing the rectitude of the whole thing, how this process from start to finish can just be made more streamlined, faster, rather than just, well, those are the segments that we deal with, and they are interrelated but not interconnected?
Yeah. Well, most importantly in any of the process is that there's truth and reconciliation for victims of any tragedy or scandal, and it's hard to generalise about how the best way to do that is across everything that we deal with. But having said that, the House, as you know, the House of Lords has just undertaken an inquiry into inquiries and how those processes operate, which we have fully participated in. We're currently working through the recommendations. So certainly our inquiries team is interested in this question of how do you best deliver truth and reconciliation for victims, and ministers in due course, will consider it. But that is an ongoing piece of work. I think it's hard to say specifically this is what a better version would be.
Thank you. We may come back to you on that in a more formal session following the Lord's report in due course. We've been sitting very quietly, but we're now going to turn our guns on you in the nicest and most gentle of ways, of course. But Mr. Baker is going to open up the questions on the Government Property Agency.
Thank you, Chair. The Controller and Auditor General has qualified its opinion on the Cabinet Office's group financial statements because of 2 issues arising in the Government Property Agency. The first was the GPA failing to gain the relevant Cabinet Office approval for contracts worth £20 million or more in relation to a site security contract. And additionally, the GPA was unable to provide sufficient evidence to the National Audit Office to complete audit testing in respects of assets under construction. Given the scale and breadth of these issues within the GPA's reporting, is it therefore fair to say that it's an organisation which is lacking sufficiently robust internal processes?
I start and then perhaps Mark should add to this. So I think the one thing I have observed as I came into the department is that the GPA has grown significantly. And this is a vast organisation. It's providing facilities management, property development, big strategic property advice for a vast government estate, and now provides about over 50% of what we do in property across government. And my personal view is that that is a very high-risk business, and the controls and assurance regime that is in that part of my department has not grown in the pace at which the risks have grown. And so what you constantly see, and this is the symptom of a weaker control environment than we should have, is the symptoms of that coming through in both customer feedback, service provision, but in these two particular instances, a control environment that was lacking. So I think we should just be really straight about that with the committee. And I'm very confident that I've got a leadership team, and it's great that Mark has come to join the GPA as the Chief Executive in the last year, and a board and a group of stakeholders who are now making sure that the control environment is fit for purpose. But I should let Mark talk about the specifics.
Before we do, I'm not undermining anything that you've just said there, Miss Little. But it's sort of slightly like saying, well, I'm going on a holiday to the Sahara and I didn't realise it was going to be hot. We're the world's 6th, 7th, 8th, depending on which data you had, largest economy, with a very mature civil service and a very interconnected linkage in property between central and local government, the MOD, and so on and so forth. It is blindingly obviously, surely, or it was, that this was both lucrative, potentially, expensive, with risks often derived by market pressures which affect values and opportunities, so on and so forth. None of that should have come as a surprise. So I suppose the fundamental question is, and we have, Hammerson's your previous employer, a well-known property business. We have a very sophisticated property sector in the United Kingdom, very advanced. Why did this sort of slightly come as a bolt from the blue?
Well, I don't think it did come as a bolt from the blue. I think if you look back in our previous annual reports and accounts, property risk and some of the big changes and some of the big expansion in the GPA has always been recognised in some way, shape or form. I do think there are some big lessons learned about when you set up large-scaled, high-risk agencies of this nature that are delivering big services on such a scale that you have got to be very, very confident in the control environment as you set things up. So I don't think it was a surprise at all, and it's our job to make sure that we close that gap quickly and effectively.
If it wasn't a surprise, it must be a disappointment.
Well, I can speak as Principal Accounting Officer. It is of huge disappointment that I have a set of accounts that are qualified and delayed. I see that as one of the core hygiene factors of my responsibilities to Parliament and to the taxpayer. So I am disappointed that we are in this position, but I'm much more interested in how we fix it.
Yes, but one needs to understand how one arrives at something that needs to be fixed. I'm still struggling to understand how, when the agency was set up, it wasn't more readily understood the breadth and depth of skills that would be required to make the agency a success.
Yeah. And forgive me, I wasn't.
And I know it predates you.
At the time, it predates me, but that is part of the work that we are undertaking, is to learn the lessons and to make sure that we therefore.
No, that's fine. But one can learn the lessons from something which arrived at something which was unforeseeable. But the government property portfolio in a complex, competitive property environment with all sorts of pressures upon it, was not foreseen, it would have been known. You could go and talk to anybody who works for any large property company. They would be doing exactly the same sort of stuff. So it must be disappointing, surely, that nobody thought to equip the agency with the skills that it would demonstrably need.
Forgive me, Chair, but I don't think that is a fair reflection of the history of what's happened here. And I want to keep this in perspective. There was absolutely recognition of the skills and the leadership and the very specialist nature of leadership that was required here. And we've had a very, very competent board who have brought a lot of those property skills to bear. And Mark and his predecessor have been working very, very hard to build that capability. But whenever you have an organisation that grows rapidly, your ability to kind of constantly manage risk is going to be challenging. And I think that's what we're recognising here. It's not to say that we didn't spot any of those issues or mitigations weren't in place. I can see that there was very good planning on building more capability. There was a recognition of the risks. And sadly, this is one of those occasions where we have got symptoms of issues occurring and it not being as good as it could have been. So I just want to make sure that we keep this within perspective. It is not as though we haven't been delivering brilliant facilities management and good services to the whole of government over the last 5 to 6 years. That has absolutely been the case, but it needs to be better.
Mr. Baker. Marcus, do you want to come on some points of detail?
I'm just wondering if we could get into some of the more of the granular detail of the points raised. There was this issue with the contract that wasn't authorised by the Cabinet Office. I think it was a £6 million. It was a security contract. What went wrong more specifically, and how can we be reassured that if this has happened once, there aren't departments across Whitehall breaching the Cabinet Office's rules on this?
Perhaps Mark can talk about the specifics, and I'll come back to cross-government.
Yeah, I'll do that. And can I just, by way of opening, say, similarly, it's regrettable that as accounting officer supporting CAT, we present these risk and control disclosures. So really happy to answer the question. I think on this specific issue, the error was in the GPA's commercial team not recognising the timing required of their approval from the Cabinet Office commercial team, and that essentially led to the irregularity that you see of £6 million expenditure during the financial year. Now, just building on Kat's point, I'm, as Kat is, really interested in what we're doing about this, and this is part of looking at this particular issue is one issue as part of a broader stabilisation and improvement across GPA. This particular area clearly is focusing on our commercial team, where we have a new chief operating officer at GPA. Is very focused on the skills and capability of that commercial team, how we manage contracts, how we train our people to manage contracts, and most importantly, how the team then collaborate and work with Cabinet Office commercial controls to plan effectively this type of activity. It's a complex environment, and this was the bringing together of a number of contracts, that were inherited across government into a consolidated set of contracts. The improvements we are delivering, I'm confident we're not going to see an irregularity of this nature, although clearly regrettable this particular issue occurred.
Is there something wrong with the contracting process? Was it simply there was an error made?
It was essentially an error.
No, there's no suggestion that process needs to be modified.
No, and we have undertaken reviews of what happened. This is an example of where an approval should have been obtained, and the commercial team in the GPA did not seek it in time for them to make the commercial decision. And to answer the second part of your first question, I'm not aware of any other circumstances of this nature across government. It is very, very well established that you have to go to the Cabinet Office for commercial approvals, and our commercial teams across government are embedded within departments and within agencies. So this happening was a misunderstanding, a training issue, and it should never have happened in the first place. But I'm confident that this is not a widespread issue. And of course, we did find it, and we have acknowledged it, and my predecessor obviously spoke to you about it at the time.
With regard to the assets under construction that was raised before, it's something like £28 million of assets that was identified that there was insufficient evidence that they were correctly classified, and that's, I believe, more than 10% of that portfolio. That seems slightly more systematic in terms of that failure. What's gone wrong there?
I might turn to our Chief Financial Officer for the department to just explain.
Yeah, so just to explain kind of what process failed there, in essence, it's the process by which an asset sitting in assets under construction, the finance team and the ops team are kind of liaising with each other to understand when that moves from assets under construction into asset. So when that work's done, when that maintenance work's done. I think a kind of really important part to understand here is this wasn't major works. You know, everybody knew when major works was completed. Those amounts relate to kind of large volumes but low values of work, and not just on property, also on things like the digital systems and the tech. So that's kind of where it came about. And, you know, I think the other point to make, you know, the problem is the kind of problem, the accounting problem that flows from that relationship between the finance teams and the operational teams. So, you know, nothing wrong has happened with that money. It's purely a classification between assets under construction and assets on the balance sheet. And the impact of that from your perspective, from a user's perspective, is those assets, you know, might be sitting in the wrong place, and we might not have started depreciation on the assets that are sitting under construction that are on the balance sheet. But I could hand over to Mark, who can kind of talk about some of the control improvements that have since been made to that process.
Thanks, Caroline. Yeah, I mean, the same theme. This is part of a broader stabilisation improvement of GPA. There is extensive work going on throughout our finance teams, our respective finance teams, but focusing on GPA. Again, improving the capability and resource of the team, and ensuring that we are addressing this with colleagues at NAO. As Caroline says, a lot of small transactions. The reclassification started during the fieldwork of the 23-24 audit, and we continue to work through that. But I'm confident that you know, with that focus, that improved control environment, those reclassifications are well in hand.
And finally, there was quite a substantial underspend on the capital department's expenditure limits. Could you explain a bit to us about what went wrong there, or what the justification is for that?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to this page 104 in the Cabinet Office accounts, and there's two broad areas that result in this underspend. One is associated with leasehold accounting and IFRS 16, which I may require Caroline's support if you'd like to dig into that one. But in short, it's associated with the liability, the balance sheet liability that the GPA would take on when entering a lease with a landlord. And in the what should happen is, as that lease is executed, you also have a series of underleases, subleases to the departments themselves, which essentially is a equal and opposite impact on the charges. There were three key items which were identified from previous years that required prior year adjustments where that hadn't happened. That is a result of some of the issues that we've already alluded to, and are very much being addressed in how we, ensure we've got a complete and accurate property database. That was the first element. The second element of the underspend related to the onboarding of properties. The budget expected and allowed for the onboarding of more properties from departments As a result of a decision to stabilise and prioritise improvement, that onboarding was essentially paused, and therefore the expenditure anticipated towards that onboarding wasn't in fact incurred.
Just quickly.
And not wishing to do your job for you, but in the spirit of conviviality that the Chair always insists on, which is quite correct, there is a danger sometimes of these committees saying, finishing a question with what went wrong there. In terms of what, in my words, the mess you found, would you actually say that's a success now? That if you were outside of this room, you'd be able to say to us in the lift, actually, we're really pleased we found it because this gives us a good route map of what we need to look like in the future?
I think it's good that we've identified the issues and are taking a very positive, open approach to fixing it. And I think it sets the right tone for an organisation. You know, we talked about test and learn. We don't always get things right. It matters that we can talk openly about, we found a problem, we're going to talk openly about it, we're going to work out what went wrong, and we're going to make sure that the team is equipped to make sure it never happens again. I think that is a very healthy thing for any organisation. You know, this isn't about repercussions or telling people off. This is about learning and making sure we never ever allow this to happen again. So from that perspective, I think it's a good and healthy process for the organisation to go through.
Yeah, and I'd certainly echo that from the perspective of the GPA team. You know, we have a relatively new CFO, COO, property director, and the team are really energised to get into this and ensure that we deliver the improvements that are expected.
Thank you, Chair.
Just before I bring back to this week, can I just, Ms. Little, pick up? You said this is not the time for repercussions and tellings off. If my understanding of the £6 million is correct, there is a tendency, much to the fury and irritation of our constituents, that government and Parliament will say, oh, well, £6 million, it's a round of drinks. And in government expenditure terms, it is a round of drinks, and it's a round of drinks at the Dog and Duck, not even at Claridge's. It's a cheap date, as it were. It's an accounting error, £6 million. It will just get washed and lost in the figures. But if I've understood what we've heard this morning, and from reading the papers, is that in essence a contract needed to be let. The process for letting the contract was understood. What was not understood or appreciated is that sometimes His Majesty's government doesn't move as quickly as we might like it to, and sometimes the decision takes a little longer through a process than one might like. But instead of pressing the pause button, the person who was trying to let the contract in any event, knowing that they were in breach of what the policy criteria was, that there was a sign-off thing. They'd either applied too late, there wasn't sufficient information, the person who had to take the decision was off sick or on holiday, it was just taking a little bit longer, and they thought, oh well, I was going to say something quite rude. Oh well, never mind, we'll let it anyway, and we'll just get retrospective sign-off. Now, if you can do that for 6 million, you can do it for 60, and if you can do it for 60 million, you can do it for 6 billion. The question, I think, which is fundamental to all of this, whilst we all understand that process and compliance can be absolutely irritating from top to bottom of the government property agency, is it understood by every single person involved that processes are in place for a purpose, and as irritating as it might be, they must be adhered to, and the rogue signing of contracts for whatever sum may be a one-off, but the lessons have to be learned, and I'm afraid tellings off and repercussions need to follow. Otherwise it's just, okay, let's take some validity and good news from the fact that we have discovered it. Good that we've discovered it because it shows transparency in the process. It's disgraceful that there was anything to discover in the first instance. Mr. Bourgeois.
My team are absolutely clear on the importance of governance, importance of regularity, and are all very clear that this is not a scenario that should be repeated.
And are they also clear that failure to adhere to that, and that answer is to be welcomed, but are they also clear that to ignore it will, on the antithesis of what Ms Little was saying, will actually lead to tellings of repercussions and a P45 without any form of voluntary payment.
Clearly, as I said, everyone understands the importance of ensuring that the regularity of this process and the consequences of not following that.
What were the consequences in this instance?
I don't have the details of that.
That's surprising. Maybe you could write to us on it. Mr. Lamb.
Just following through that theme, I mean, it's not simply about money. In principle, civil servants are in a position to take very many decisions, whether or not they have authorisation to do so. I would like to point out that technically is a coup d'etat, taking power to oneself that one is not authorised to have, for which there should be very serious repercussions of which the committee should be made aware. We cannot have a situation in which people are acting without authorisation on the assumption they'll get permission later down the line.
This is a very good point. Mr. Baker.
So I was just going to come back to the overall issues around oversight. I was going to come back to the overall issues around oversight, if that's okay.
Yes, and then I'll ask Ms. Little to respond.
Because at the outset of this set of questions, you said the control team in the department hadn't grown at pace with the level of risk within the GPA. So I'm just keen to understand if that has now been addressed and there's a right level of oversight of financial management, control and reporting in the GPA to ensure that we're not going to have similar issues occurring this year or in future years as well.
Absolutely. So there are three different layers of assurance that we've strengthened here. So firstly, in terms of our sponsorship as a department, we've got a dedicated sponsorship team. We've also got the UK Government Investments team involved, who are our corporate governance and assurance experts in government working with us. Our corporate finance team, and Caroline, as our Chief Financial Officer, has a very close, detailed working relationship. And we've also got our internal auditors currently assessing those sponsorship arrangements to make sure they are as robust and tight as they should be. Secondly, since taking on this role, I've spent quite a lot of time with the board and with our senior leadership. I obviously line manage Mark, and we have set out the very clear expectations around performance improvement and assurance, and we regularly assess that performance at board level, and I personally meet with the board to have that conversation. So we are setting the tone, we are putting in place the controls and the assurance around the organisation, but we're also working together in partnership to make sure that it has the best chance of succeeding. And I'm much more confident a year on than I was when I first took on this role.
And so in terms of taking forward this work, have you been able to source all the relevant expertise in government, or have you had to get external advice about addressing these issues?
Yeah, so, and Caroline, you might want to add to this.
Yeah, so I would say largely the expertise in government. So we haven't had paid for external advice, but we've increased the capacity and the capability of the finance teams in GPA, much more close working with the Cabinet Office finance teams. We're really kind of monitoring what's happening in these accounts and getting lots of visibility.
Thank you. Peter.
Thank you. I mean, and thank you for your answers to the questions today. It's provided insight into the management of the GPA. I'm afraid to say that I'm still not entirely certain as to the purpose of the GPA. Anyone who experienced the Lansley reforms and the impact upon the NHS has seen that the impact of having one centralised property team managing that scale of property creates enormous challenges, or I'd say fairly deep problems in terms of the actual provision of services. The greater the distance between the end user and those facilitating the properties, you tend to find the greater the problems in actually trying to make those suitable for the purpose of that particular team. I presume that the goal ultimately was a better utilisation of government space in much the same way as elsewhere. We've managed to achieve that through things like One Public Estate. Frankly, I think putting spare space up on a website on the internet might do some of that job for you. But given that the purpose appears to be to save money, could you tell us how much money has been saved by the formation of the GPA?
So, the purpose is very clear. It's a smaller, greener, better government estate. GPA focuses on its on the offices, although the remit does extend to warehouses. I very much see the organisation as that collaborative supporter of that smaller, leaner, agile state and the missions that Kat's described. The savings to date have been reasonably substantial. There's been a particular focus on London. Over £250 million of rent costs have been saved through consolidation of over 40 buildings in London. There's several examples then many examples in cities throughout the UK where those savings have also been delivered. I think it's also important to make the point very briefly that in addition to saving money, there's clearly, I'm very focused as our team on creating brilliant environments for civil servants to work, to enable them to deliver those government missions, and also to be able to drive growth where we may take a hub in a certain location to facilitate a broader regeneration prospect.
Thank you.
Just on that very briefly, it looks as if England is about to embark on quite a large-scale reform of local government. The local government itself owns property assets, town halls, etc. Lot will have bought commercial property to fill gaps in the revenue budget, etc. I know I did when I was a cabinet member for finance on West Oxfordshire District Council, and I know that the outcomes have been sort of patchy in some. The GPA has a huge reservoir of intelligence, expertise, and all the rest of it. Given the fact that it's all public money, public purse, what, if anything, can the GPA do to assist colleagues in local government with property matters to effectively derive better or best value for the taxpayer?
Well, the first thing I'd note is clearly we work very closely with our sponsor department, Office of Government Property, who clearly take a broader interest in real estate across government and across departments. So I think my colleague Mark Chivers would be better placed to answer that broader question. Okay. What I can say is clearly where we have a particular location, a particular hub, then we engage very closely with local government to ensure that we're getting the best possible outcome, both locally as well as nationally for civil service.
If I could add, so the Office for Government Property recently had a hearing with the PAC actually on some of this, and at that session we set out that ultimately what our job is to provide expertise where we can, and a good area where we do that with local governments is in relation to private finance in particular, where we've got a large number of private finance initiatives coming to an end, and we want to use the collective expertise within government to support local government. So we do that wherever it's possible to share expertise and information. Chair, could I possibly just come back to the comment that Mr. Lamb made, because I didn't get a chance to respond, and I think it is really important for the record in that, and of course I very much agree with you, if an official is found to sign a contract without authorisation, that is a very, very, very serious offence, and that is not what we are describing here. My understanding is at the time an active decision was made by the department to allow the contract to proceed because of the level of savings associated with it and the timetable under which that procurement was being undertaken. And that was a decision that my predecessor was aware of at the time. So this isn't a rogue decision made by an individual. And I think that really matters constitutionally, because it is not possible for a civil servant to enter into contracts without there being a level of oversight either by the department or by the Treasury or by ministers. And the scheme of delegation that we operate for our controls within government has checks and balances throughout to make sure that that is not the case. So I just wanted to say that, because I think I wouldn't want anyone listening to this discussion to think that civil servants can commit in the way that you've described.
Yeah, I mean, even if it's the position is taken by the department, someone within that department has taken the decision to sign that contract regardless of not having sign-off. And I can imagine that being potentially acceptable in some scenarios, but those usually involve some elected representative being involved in the decision-making. So was a minister involved in taking the decision to enable that contract to be signed without government approval?
I'd need to double check, but I'm assuming that went through normal Treasury approval, so it would have had the Chief Secretary approval at the time, and that's my point, is there's not a single thing that we do that doesn't come back to a ministerial authority, and that is important.
I'm not entirely sure that's helpful. I'm not entirely sure I think that might have been more helpful at the top of the conversation than...
Exactly, sorry, and apologies, I didn't get a chance to say that.
I just want to ask you... it's a big question. I want to deal with it quite quickly. The next time any of us sit down and talk to a serial killer, not a sort of start of a question you ever really expect, and you ask a serial killer by the count, what was the hardest thing? They will always answer, my first murder. Everything else becomes easier after the first. Every government every party coming into government talks about a slimming down of the state, public bodies, quangos, a bonfire of the quangos, etc., etc., and so on. And by the end of the Parliament, one usually finds that in actual fact the bonfires just got bigger, or the things to burn have got bigger. DOHSC have led the charge magnificently, in my assessment, by saying actually the NHS can work jolly well without NHS England, and ministers will just have to take more accountability and give more direction. Amen to that. But it's let her start the path, has it not? Who's picking up the baton now and saying, right, NHS England, probably the largest in terms of budget and numbers, well, if we can do it to that, there's a lot of lower hanging fruit which is in easy grip and grasp.
So the Cabinet Office is leading that work under the direction of the CDL as part of our Productive and Agile State work. And we recently commissioned every government department to assess all of their arm's length bodies against 4 principles. And those 4 principles were to go and check the accountabilities from ministerial policy oversight to ensure, similarly to the NHS example, that there is direct accountability and that the accountability and oversight procedures are clear, and if not, to look at whether that ALB should exist in that form. Secondly, to look at where we can eliminate waste, inefficiency and duplication, and I think again arguments made in the NHS example were identification of duplication and inefficiency. Thirdly was we quite often have ALBs where they've been set up to manage stakeholder groups specifically, and we've said that is not a good reason to set up an ALB. If anything, that's a reason to bring them closer into the centre of government. And fourth, we've looked at where there may be a genuine need for genuine independent regulation and oversight. We would like that to be clarified and tested. So every department provided their returns yesterday to me, and we are currently going through all of those returns.
And if they've said, this ALB, nobody can remember why we set it up, nobody really knows what it does, nobody can see what demonstrable benefit it brings to the British citizen in their daily lives or the efficient delivery of government. Is it the individual Secretary of State who then takes out the pearl-handled revolver and glass of whiskey and says, go and lock yourself in a room? Or does Cabinet Office just go, you're out, you're finished?
So, as always, it's the Cabinet Office's job to challenge and advise and to set out what we think the answers are, which is why we've set out these principles. And any ALB where we're in the circumstances you describe, you can expect the Cabinet Office to be saying that does not seem to be a very good reason for that ALB to exist, and we will come up with recommendations. Of course, it will be for the individual Secretary of State because it is their structures and their department. So ultimately, it depending on the nature of the decision, depending on the ALB, will have a level of either collective agreement or decision-making with the individual Secretary of State.
How do you then avoid the risk of... because very often departmental officials will have struck a good relationship with the people in the ALB, who then in their submissions to ministers say, but of course there were 3 reasons, of course, where you could get rid of it, but there were 6 absolutely compelling reasons where we have to keep it. there's a tendency, or there's a danger, is there not, a risk of effectively departments marking their own homework? Is it not better that Cabinet Office just goes, case not made, we're ending this?
That is in effect the process that we are going through. You know, we're there to provide the system check and balance and the challenge, and the public bodies team and the team that specialises in this area will be going through those returns to see what we think.
Yeah, but there's a difference between think and deciding. So is it the individual Secretary of State who would say, Cabinet Office are telling me organisation X can be wound up or recalibrated. Officials are saying, yes, Cabinet Office have got it right, or no, Secretary of State, Cabinet Office have got it wrong. The Secretary of State then comes to a decision contrary to that which CDL and the Cabinet Office would have liked to have seen. Is that then the end of the matter?
So I think it will be, and look, we're only just going through this process. I think it will depend, and it will depend on the circumstances, but what I'm very clear on is it will be a political decision, and it will be politically informed by the work that's being overseen by the CDL and ultimately the Secretary of State responsible for the ALB. And I think it really will depend on the nature of the decisions being made as to how that final decision gets made, but it will be politically overseen.
There's no route map to decision set out and agreed between Cabinet Office and individual and departments collectively.
It's our usual decision-making process, which is the Cabinet Office convening systems advice and providing what we think the assessment is, and working with departments to make agreements about what we therefore do about it. So I think it's a well-trodden path in the world of government. So I don't think there's a need to sort of set out how we make decisions in government, but CDL oversees the process collectively for the system, and we work with individual departments to make a final decision. That is the normal process.
I don't say this to be either churlish or provocative, but a well-trodden path can lead somewhere, but a well-trodden path can also lead to a cul-de-sac. If it's a well-trodden path and there is a litany of ministers of all political persuasion saying we have to trim this is costing too much, it's all gone a bit mad, and the decision path, or it's a well-trodden path, and yet we still can see a growth with no diminution of public bodies, ALBs, quangos, call them what you will. It's not a very fruitful path. So I just wonder whether there shouldn't be a more prescriptive, definitive, actually, there'll be some sort of star chamber, if it's contested, some sort of star chamber convened by Cabinet Office, but at the end of the day it's the CDL who can either seize alike, put the thumb up or the thumb down.
Well, you can call it a star chamber if you like, but in effect the CDL will convene a meeting to go through the recommendations and the advice that we have off the back of the review. If you want to call it a particular thing, that's fine, but that's what you've described is ultimately the process. And look, every decision here has got to be linked to the outcomes that we're trying to achieve. This is not just a numbers game. This is about actually improving delivery and improving the problems and the outcomes that we're striving for. So depending on the nature of that will depend on the final escalation route for decision making.
Forgive me, Ms. Ether, if I've either misheard or more than likely misunderstood. If there is a contested view on an issue, are you telling us that through a consultative mechanism, but ultimately the person who either puts their thumb up or thumb down is the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster?
Well, he is ultimately the person overseeing this process. So, yes, I mean, ultimately it is his review.
He could overrule the Secretary of State.
Obviously, ultimately the process is to try not to get to a point where we're disagreeing.
That, but we've gone through the process and we've arrived at a logjam. CDL is convinced that organisation X is now surplus to requirements, and the sponsoring department is not.
Yes, so in this scenario of a disagreement, you would expect for CDL to take a view and ultimately to escalate to a cabinet committee or to other mechanisms within government if a collective view is needed. So I think it really does depend, and I'm not going to sit here and prescribe how every decision about every area of government is going to be decided on. I think that ultimately is for ministers.
Yes, okay. And that's why we'll watch this, see it, fingers crossed, and see how it comes out. Approach, but good luck with it. It's a piece of work, as I think we've all recognised, is long overdue. I can see no other hands from colleagues. It's been an interesting session. There's a couple of commitments to receive some written follow-up, for which we are appreciative and look forward to receiving. Thank you all very much indeed for your time in attending this morning.